Hi, we are going to do the review video for the Unit 2 retake. And the point of this video is to help sort of remind you about some of the key content that we covered in Unit 2. Feel free to stop at any time, and then you can restart when it works best for you. But the point is that I want to try to make sure that you understand the key ideas. There are a lot of information is discussed in the chapters on Congress, the President, and the courts. And so I'm not covering all of them, but I sort of focused on the most important things so that you'll be good to go for the retake. We're going to start off with Congress. The Constitution gives a lot of expressed powers to Congress. Reminder, expressed powers are powers that are expressed directly. They're written specifically in the Constitution. So one is that Congress is the power of the purse. So the president doesn't get to decide how much money is allocated or spent on different projects. The president doesn't get to decide how much money is requested in taxes. Like, those are things that Congress has the power. Congress has the power to regulate commerce or trade, both to regulate trade between the states, as well as Congress, because they have the power to ratify treaties to, trade between the United States and other countries. Congress has several defense powers, like they have the power to declare war, they have the power to create an army and a navy, and they have the power to fund them. And so those are their defense powers. They also have immigration powers because they get to decide how many people get to come in the United States, what are the requirements for becoming a citizen, how many people they're going to allow to become citizens, those types of things. Congress has the power to coin money, and they were given that specific power because if you recall, under the Articles of Confederation, all different states had different types of money, and that was one of our many economic problems that was caused under the Articles of Confederation. So they decided specifically to give Congress the power to have one national currency. Then lastly, Congress has the power to create court systems. So like the Constitution creates the Supreme Court, but we have a lot of federal court systems, like for the military, for the IRS, for federal appeals courts, for district courts, and all of those have been created by Congress. So Congress got to create the entire court infrastructure. Also, Congress has what are called implied powers, which are not directly stated in the Constitution. However, they must be tied to an express power. Like, Congress can't just give themselves any powers willy-nilly. So, for example, one of the defense powers that I talked about for Congress is that they have the power to raise an army. So the Supreme Court has ruled that Congress, therefore, would have the power to initiate a draft, because it would make sense that for their expressed power to raise an army, that they would have the power to be able to get people in that army if, for example, enough people weren't signing up. Also, for Congress, it's important to understand the similarities between the House of Representatives and the Senate. So some of the key similarities are that they both use committees, right? They both have standing committees. Pretty much everyone in Congress, unless you're a part of national leadership, are assigned to a standing committee. Those standing committees are where the bills are assigned, and that's where the meat of the work in Congress is done in those committees, and that is true for both the House and the Senate. Also, because most of the time the House and the Senate pass two different versions of a bill, members of the House and the Senate are involved in conference committees pretty regularly. And so, because they iron out the differences so that then one version of the bill will be sent to the president. So that's a similarity. Key differences between the House and the Senate, like the most obvious one, I don't even have listed on the slide because we talked about it a lot last unit, which is that the House uses proportional representation, right? So they have 435 members, and the bigger states get more votes. Whereas in the Senate, there's only 100 members in every state, regardless of whether or not you're puny or giant, you get 2 members. But aside from that, some of the key differences are that their constitutional powers are different. Really, the most important power that the House has is that they have the power of the purse. All money bills and all taxing bills have to start in the House of Representatives. Whereas the Senate has a lot of powers that are sort of unique in terms of checking the president, right? So all key appointments have to be confirmed by the Senate. That would include Supreme Court justices, ambassadors, cabinet officials. The Senate also has the power to declare war, and the Senate has the power to ratify treaties. And so those are all key checks on the president, and they're all given to the Senate. Their rules for debate are different. Like, so in the Senate, they they are a smaller chamber. They only have 100 people, and their leadership positions don't have the ability to shut people up. So a strategy the minority party can use in the Senate is to literally talk a bill to death. Whereas that wouldn't be a strategy that you could use in the House of Representatives, because the Speaker of the House would rule you out of order and tell you to shut up. And so in the House, it's very hierarchical, very top-down, and the House is very strict debate. Like how many amendments, how long is it going to be the debate, what bills are going to be debated, who's going to get to debate. All those things are decided by the Speaker and the House Rules Committee. And so that's a pretty key difference, and is one of the reasons why you could end up having one bill pass the House and another bill not pass the Senate, or vice versa. The leadership positions are also a key difference. So I just described the role of the Speaker. The Speaker basically has the ability to have a lot of power and is third in line for the president, and gets to decide what things get debated, how long things get debated, who gets to speak, and has the power to cut off debate. In the Senate, there's no one who has the power to cut off debate. That power does not exist. The president of the Senate is the vice president of the country, and he or she only gets to do things in the Senate if there's a tie. The VP can't speak if there's a debate, and so really the VP is not in the Senate most of the time because their power is only rarely used. Most of the time it's the president pro temp who's actually running and facilitating the debate. However, this person has a leadership position, but this leadership position is very weak, particularly if you compare this leadership position with the Speaker of the House, because the Speaker can cut off debate, whereas the President pro temp, because of the filibuster rule, cannot cut off debate. The majority leader is the person who has the most power in the Senate. They are the one who has the most votes. They're the ones who are sort of organizing, what issues are going to get to the floor and sort of making the deals. There's also a majority leader and the Speaker in the House of Representatives, but that person is really the Speaker of the House's sidekick. They're number 2 in control in the House, whereas the majority leader in the Senate is really the top dog. There are 4 types of committees in Congress, and it's important for you to be familiar with all of them. I've already spent some time talking about standing and conference committees. Standing committees are what the bills get assigned to. They deal with a particular area of public policy, like agriculture or military affairs or transportation. And most of the time there is one committee in the House and one committee in the Senate. Most people in the House and the Senate are assigned to at least one standing committee, and they become experts in that policy area. And if a bill does not get through the standing committee, it does not get debated on the House or the Senate floor. They are really the experts on the topics, and they are supposed to weed out the junk bills. Conference committees are where bills go if the House and the Senate pass 2 versions of the same bill, but they don't agree on all the topics. And so then the conference committee would be made up of members of the House and the Senate, and they would iron out the differences, and then the bill would go back to the House and the Senate for a straight up or down vote. And then if it got approved, it would then go to the president, because you can't send 2 versions of the same bill to the president. Joint committees are ones where you have members of the House and the Senate on together, and they would be in an area of interest to both the House and the Senate. However, generally speaking, they don't come up with laws. That's what standing committees do. So for example, there is a joint committee on the Library of Congress. So both the House and the Senate get to have say in the running of that Library of Congress, but it's not an area of enough prestige that they would both want to have their own committee. Lastly, select committees. Select committees are generally temporary. In a select committee, they are investigating a select or specific topic, and then they are putting together a report to give back to the House or the Senate. Select committees would either have senators or House members on it, and they would be making proposals for areas of legislation possibly, but they can't pass legislation themselves. So for example, the 9/11 Commission would be an example of a select committee. So after 9/11, I don't remember if it was the House or the Senate, I think it was the House, put together a select committee, and they investigated what happened with 9/11, and then the select committee put together a list of recommendations, and one of which was to reorganize the executive branch and create the Department of Homeland Security, which they then gave that proposal to the House, and then that was passed, and then the Senate passed it, and then the President signed it into law, and then we created a new cabinet. It's important to understand the checks and balances that Congress has. So Congress can check the president. One is through the power of oversight. Like they can have congressional committees, they can investigate the president, they can investigate a department that the president is in charge of, like the Justice Department or the Environmental Protection Agency. But they are basically have the ability to sort of oversee what the executive branch is doing. They have the job of approving key appointments like ambassadorships, Supreme Court justices, cabinet officials. They have the job of approving treaties, declaring war. They have the power to override a presidential veto. However, that would take a 2/3 vote from both houses of Congress. And this is a power that is rarely used because it is very hard for that many members of Congress to agree that the president is wrong. So technically, it's a check that they have on the president, but it's pretty hard for them to use. They also have the capacity to pick the president if there's no winner from the Electoral College. And they have the power to impeach and potentially even to remove the president from office if the president is doing something wrong. And we talked about that when we talked about the Nixon administration and particularly the case U.S. v. Nixon. Congress can check the courts as well. First of all, they have the power to approve Supreme Court justices. If they disagree with the constitutional ruling of the Supreme Court, they could amend the Constitution. Granted, they can't do that without the states as well, but they could start that constitutional amendment process. And finally, if someone in the courts is doing something that's highly unethical, they also have the power to impeach a Supreme Court justice or a federal justice, just the same way that they have the power to impeach or remove the president. Talking about the president, there are two key amendments that are important for you to understand when talking about the president. The first is the 22nd Amendment. The 22nd Amendment put that informal amendment that the president should only serve 2 terms and turned it into a formal amendment, right? So the president is limited to 2 terms or 10 years. Yes, the president's terms are 4 years each, but the 10 years piece is so that if someone went from the vice president to the president and they only served 2 years of the other person's term, technically they could run for 2 more terms. Also, the 25th Amendment is important to understand. The 25th Amendment sets up the order of presidential succession so that if the president dies or is removed from office or resigns, then the job would go to the VP. After the VP, then it would go to the Speaker of the House. After the Speaker of the House, it would go to the President Pro Temp and the Senate. After the President Pro Temp and the Senate, it would go to the Secretary of State, and then the rest of the cabinet officials and the order in which their cabinet department was created. Checks and balances for the president are also important to understand. So the president has some key ways that he or she can check Congress. The one that the president uses most often or threatens to use the most often is the power of the veto. Congress is not going to be interested in spending a lot of time working on a bill if the president says that when it gets to his desk, they're going to kill it. The president, through the State of the Union address, gets to recommend to members of Congress what legislation she or he wants Congress to pass, and so that's an important power that is given to the president from the Constitution. However, the president has a power that's not in the Constitution as well, which is that if the president is very popular, the president can take his or her ideas to the public, and if those ideas become very powerful or popular with the public, then that will exert pressure on Congress to pass those ideas that the president is proposing. Lastly, technically, Congress has the power to declare war, but the president has the power of being the commander-in-chief, and that is given to the president in the Constitution. So even though the president has to ask Congress to declare war, the fact is that the president, especially with the power of nuclear warheads, has the ability to send warheads and, start a war or, attack another country without even getting congressional approval. And so that's a pretty big check on the powers of Congress. The president also has the power to check the Supreme Court or the court system. So first of all, if someone is found guilty, the president can pardon that person. Now that means that the president can find them not guilty. And that is a power the president does not like to use very often because, of course, people do not like to have, people who are actually committed crimes go like willy-nilly. But also, what if the courts make a mistake? This way, the president has the capacity to try to check that back. The president can also give a reprieve, which means that the president can lower someone's sentence. So the president can say, hey, I think the death penalty is too much. I'm going to give you life imprisonment. Or if the president says, yeah, I think life imprisonment is too long, I'm going to give you 30 years. So the president can change somebody's sentence. Now, that's only if they're convicted by a federal court. That is not if they are convicted by a state court. Lastly, the president can give amnesty to a group of people. So, for example, President Carter in the 1970s gave amnesty to people who fled the United States during the Vietnam War when they were drafted, and said that those people were no longer considered criminals, so that those people could come back to the United States. And that's an example of amnesty, when you give a pardon into a group of people. The president, lastly, can also check the courts by appointing Supreme Court justices. And obviously, presidents like to appoint justices that are going to agree with their interpretation of the Constitution. But that is a way that the president can actually have quite a long impact, because even though a president could only serve for 8 to 10 years, a Supreme Court justice could be in office for like 20, 30 years. And so that would be a way that the president could really leave a lasting impact. So there are, in terms of this question of how have presidents informally expanded their power, there are 3 ways that presidents have power that are not actually in the Constitution, that we have made up over time, that are examples of informal amendments that we talked about during Unit 1. So one is this idea of executive privilege, which we talked about in U.S. v. Nixon. So presidents can keep information confidential from the courts as well as from Congress, because the president is supposed to have access to top secret information in order to do his or her job. 2, the president can issue what are called executive agreements, where the president signs a deal with a leader from another country and then doesn't go through the Senate like the president would have to with a treaty. And then lastly, the president could issue an executive order. Executive orders have the same power as a law passed by Congress, but the president can't just make up laws about anything. The executive order would have to do with something that is within the president's jurisdiction. So it would have to deal with something that is an executive branch area that the president's in charge of. So like, because the president was upset that Congress wasn't passing gun control legislation, the president ordered the FBI, which works under the president in the executive branch, to work with state and local law enforcement on background checks. And so that was an executive order. So the president has the ability to direct people that work for the president, and that has the same standing as a congressional law. And none of those 3 things are actually in the Constitution. Our last area is the courts. It's important to understand what the term judicial review means. Judicial review means that the courts have the ability to decide whether or not the actions by lower courts or state courts or the president or Congress are or are not constitutional. And once the Supreme Court says that something isn't constitutional, there's very little one of the other branches can do. Why is it important to our democracy? It's important to our democracy because our democracy only works if the other branches and the other areas of government are actually following the Constitution. Otherwise, we could end up with a dictator, right? And so the idea is that the power of judicial review is important because we need to have somebody who's unbiased, looking at whether or not the government's actions are or are not keeping true to the Constitution. That's important. How does the Supreme Court decide a case? Well, first of all, they use what's called the Rule of 4. So if you notice from the picture below, there are 9 Supreme Court justices. If any 4 say they want to examine a case, the other 5 justices will go along and say, yes, we will agree to look at that case. They will hear arguments for and against, and then they will talk amongst themselves in private. None of us get to see that. And they will decide how they're going to vote. The majority opinion is written by the justices that are on the majority side. Most of the decisions currently that come out of the Supreme Court are 5-4 decisions because we have a very split Supreme Court. So the 5 justices that agree with each other will write a majority opinion and explain why they voted the way that they did. And they write, basically, it's like a book. It's like, 100 pages or more where they're explaining, hey, we think that this is what lower courts should do, because they're trying to set a precedent that they want all the other courts to follow, and they're trying to give direction to the government for what is or isn't legal on that question. The justices that don't agree, they don't just sit there and twiddle their thumbs. They write what's called the minority opinion. And so they explain, hey, we disagree with you, and we disagree with you for these reasons. And so they explain why they don't agree with the majority. The concurring opinion is written sometimes. So if 5 justices all agree with each other, but 3 think it's a 14th Amendment issue and 2 think it's a First Amendment issue, then 3 justices would write the majority opinion, and then the other 2 justices would write the concurring, or sometimes called concurrent opinion. And what the concurring opinion says is, yes, we agree with you, so-and-so won the case, but we agree with you for a different reason. And so you're basically explaining why you voted the way you did, because you want to provide some explanation to what your, basically why you saw the Constitution in a slightly different way. So I've gone over the key ideas that we've talked about in terms of the Congress, the President, and the courts. Remember, the retake exam will be short answer and fill in the blank. Please use your study guide in this video to help you prepare, and please also let me know if there's anything else I could do to help you, and good luck.